The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 1. Discovery and Early Planting. Chapter 5, Samoset and Squanto, as well as Chapter 6, the famous Thanksgiving and a Drought. When the Pilgrims finally located a suitable area to settle and came ashore, they fell to their knees and thanked God, reaffirming their continuing reliance upon Him. Their new colony became known as Plymouth Plantation, or the Plymouth Colony, the first settlement in what would become Massachusetts. Those early days were difficult. They had arrived in November, and winter had fully set in. Having no homes in which to take shelter, they searched several weeks for a favorable location on which to build. And because of the long voyage, lack of provisions, harsh conditions, most of them were sick. In fact, during the height of the illness, only 6 or 7 of the more than 100 people who originally set out on the Mayflower were strong enough to move about. But that handful worked hard on behalf of the rest. As Governor Bradford affirmed, those few spared no pains, night or day, but with abundance of toil and the hazard of their health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them. In a word, did all the homely and necessary offices for them which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear named. And all this willingly and cheerfully, without any grudging in the least, showing herein their true love unto their friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. Despite their best efforts, half the Pilgrims died that first winter, yet the next spring, when the Mayflower returned from England, not one of the surviving Pilgrims chose to go back. They all stayed, for they had come neither for personal convenience nor monetary reward. They came for religious and civil liberty, and to become what they called stepping stones, for others to follow after them and do the same, but perhaps with fewer hardships and greater success. That spring they had their first encounter with the natives. In Europe they had heard dreadful tales of the savagery and barbaric behavior of the natives, so they were understandably fearful. But despite their concerns, that first contact passed without incident. Not long afterward, a solitary wandering Indian named Samoset came among them, and to their astonishment spoke to them in broken English. He explained that he had learned the language from English explorers and fishermen who occasionally visited the coast. Samoset informed the Pilgrims that the Pawtuxet, a fierce, warring people recently wiped out by a strange plague, previously inhabited the land on which the Pilgrims now lived. Due to the devastating nature of the epidemic, neighboring tribes were afraid to come near the place. They believed that some great supernatural spirit had destroyed the people there and might also kill them. The land was therefore left abandoned and open until the Pilgrims, unaware of the former plague, arrived. Samoset warned the Pilgrims that any Indians they encountered were likely to be hostile. This disposition was in part a reaction to an English ship captain attached to the Virginia colony who had previously visited the region and kidnapped natives to sell into slavery. The Pilgrims learned much more from Samoset, and consistent with their biblical character, they treated him as a friend. He eventually departed, promising to bring some of the neighboring Wampanoag Indians to visit them. True to his word, a few days later, Samoset returned with Massasoit, chief of the tribe, and some of his men. After making peace treaty with the Pilgrims, Chief Massasoit and his men returned home. Among these Indians had been Squanto. He was a surviving member of the violent Patuxet tribe on whose land the Pilgrims were now living. But when Massasoit and his men left, Squanto stayed. Unexpectedly, he spoke fluent English, was well versed in English thinking and customs, and adopted the Pilgrims as his own family. He showed them how to thrive in the new land, teaching them to hunt, fish, and raise crops. It was as if Squanto had a special assignment to keep the Pilgrims alive. They became his sole focus. Squanto was more prepared than any other individual anywhere in the world to help the Pilgrims survive. He certainly knew the new world, America, for it was his world, and he could teach the Pilgrims how to live in it. But Squanto also knew the old world, Europe and England, and its thinking and habits. He was probably one of the only living people at the time who could have effectively bridged the gap between the two cultures and the two worlds. And of all the places he could have been, he was right there, on the spot with the people who needed him the most. How did this happen? The backstory of Squanto is as fascinating as it is interesting. In 1614, 6 years before the Pilgrims arrived, Captain Thomas Hunt's ship was among a group of vessels exploring New England. When the other ships departed, Hunt remained behind with his crew and kidnapped 27 Indians, one of whom was Squanto. He took them to Spain and began selling them as slaves. Some Catholic friars learned what was happening and intervened, purchasing Squanto and the remaining Indians. They freed these Indians and introduced them to Christianity. At that time, the Catholics had a number of societies that worked to free slaves, whether native or African, black or white, Christian or pagan. From Spain, Squanto worked his way to England, where he remained 5 years, thoroughly learning the English language and customs. In 1619, he returned to his home in New England with Captain Thomas Dermer. On his arrival, Squanto discovered that a plague had killed his entire tribe. He was the last member alive, no longer having a people. Squanto joined himself to the neighboring Wampanoag. When the Pilgrims unexpectedly arrived the following year, he saw how woefully unprepared they were for the new land and knew he could help these English newcomers. Everything he had experienced, all the tragedies that had beset him, had prepared him for that very moment. By the providence of God, Squanto now had a unique purpose for life. He would see that the Pilgrims survived at the place where his tribe had not. With Squanto's help, the Pilgrims harvested sufficient food for their upcoming second winter. They had no surplus, but things definitely looked much better than they had the preceding year when half the colonists had died. Governor William Bradford therefore appointed a day of Thanksgiving, for they had much for which to be grateful. They now had a place where they could freely worship God. They had survived their first year in the wilderness of New England, and with Squanto's help, they had reaped a good harvest. Grateful for these blessings, the Pilgrims invited their Wampanoag neighbors to celebrate and give thanks to God with them. Chief Massasoit and some 90 of his men came and feasted with the remaining Pilgrims. The Pilgrims and their Indian neighbors dined on deer, turkey, fish, lobster, eels, vegetables, cornbread, herbs, berries, and pies. Are you getting hungry yet? They also engaged in athletic competition, including running, wrestling, and shooting. Chief Massasoit enjoyed himself so much, that he and his men stayed for 3 days. A common narrative today is that Indians hated the colonists because of their land-grabbing practices and general racist disdain for natives. However, the first Thanksgiving shows that this claim is both illogical and completely unfounded. After all, the 53 remaining Pilgrims were comprised of 4 women, 14 young boys and girls, 13 infants and young children, and only 22 men. On the other hand, the 90 Indians were all warriors. If there had been ill will, the Indians could have eliminated the Pilgrims in a matter of minutes. But they did not. They were friends. The Pilgrim story is one of many demonstrating that modern portrayals of the early colonists are often inaccurate. By the way, this was not the first Thanksgiving in America. There had been several others prior to this one, but only as occasions of prayer. This Pilgrim event birthed the tradition of Thanksgiving as a time that includes not only prayer, but also feasting and athletic events. Shortly after this celebration, as winter was setting in, 35 new settlers unexpectedly arrived. They were family and friends of the Pilgrims who gladly welcomed them. The new group brought no provisions with them, so the Pilgrims freely shared their own food, clothing, and homes. But with the new arrivals, their remaining winter supplies were cut to half allowance for each person. It was difficult, but thanks to Squanto's help, they now better knew how to live in the New England wilderness and thus survived, having been more adequately prepared for this, their second winter. When spring finally came, their provisions were almost completely gone. They spied a boat approaching on the horizon and were hopeful that the English company that had originally sponsored their colony was sending them provisions. But the boat did not bring any food. Instead, it brought 7 more hungry people. That summer, another 60 men showed up. Many were sick, but the Pilgrims gladly took care of them. They stayed all summer and eventually left, having depleted the Pilgrims' meager supplies and expressing no gratitude for their help. Yet the Pilgrims continued to put their trust in God, and no one starved. Although there were many days when, as Governor Bradford acknowledged, they, quote, had need to pray that God would give them their daily bread above all the people in the world, end quote. But now, being able to grow crops and hunt, they survived. Squanto had taught them how to live with the land rather than against it, and his Pilgrim students learned their lessons well. But after 2 years under his tutelage, much to their sorrow, their friend and mentor became mortally ill. As Squanto was passing from this world to the next, Governor Bradford reported that he, quote, desired me to pray for him, that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. He bequeathed sundry of his things to sundry of his English friends, as remembrances of his love, of whom they had a great loss, end quote. Without Squanto, the story of the Pilgrims might have been quite different, ending in tragedy rather than a success. Bradford openly acknowledged that Squanto, quote, was a special instrument sent of God for our good, end quote. One of the initial problems for the Pilgrims was that they practiced a form of socialism. The fruits of their labor were put into a common pot and split among all. It didn't take long for those inclined to laziness to find that this was a system that suited them well. They could receive provisions without working. The result was inefficiency, non-productivity, and injustice. According to Governor Bradford, those who promoted socialism thought, quote, they were wiser than God, end quote. But experience proved they were not. Jamestown had early adopted socialism, and it had been disastrous there as well. Their governor, John Smith, combated that failing system by citing the biblical principles that, quote, if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Those Virginia colonists rejected that guidance, flatly refusing to work. But more on this later. In Plymouth, however, when the Pilgrims learned the Bible's teachings, they embraced them, including that of 1 Timothy 5:8, which states, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Applying this principle saved the colony. The biblical focus on individual rights and responsibilities is a core element of the free market system, especially the requirement that every person provide for his own family, not that of someone else. Clearly, everybody did not have the same skill set. One person might have been an excellent cooper or barrel maker, while another was a noted cobbler or shoemaker, maybe a superb hunter, or a remarkable blacksmith. But because each had a particular skill by which he could provide for his own family, the blacksmith might take a pair of hinges he had made and exchange it for 2 turkeys shot by the hunter, and the cobbler might trade a pair of shoes for a barrel in which to keep his potatoes. Each was providing for his own household by his own hard work, and having different individual skills, they were able to buy, barter, and trade with others for everything they needed. Citizens knew what they wanted and how much they were willing to exchange for it, and it all occurred without undue interference by the government. Applying biblical principles, the Pilgrims began to move away from the socialist style of farming they had practiced at their arrival. They adopted an early free market individual approach, assigning every family their own personal parcel of land. Of the new free market system, Governor Bradford reported, "This has been a very good success, for it had made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means the governor or any other could use, and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege, fake or pretend, weakness and inability." Once the Pilgrims began abandoning socialism and adopting the individual free enterprise model, their productivity dramatically increased and abundance began to emerge among them. They were able to directly benefit from their own hard work and the fruit of their personal labors, and they planted 7 times more than they had only 2 years earlier. The Pilgrims finally had high hopes for an abundant crop, but as often as the case is, things did not go as planned. For according to Bradford, the Lord seemed to blast, scorch, and take away the same crops, and to threaten further and more sore famine unto them by a great drought, which continued from the 3rd week in May till about the middle of July, without any rain and with great heat for the most part, insomuch as the corn began to wither away. In response to this unexpected drought, Bradford reported that they had set apart a solemn day of humiliation to seek the Lord by humble and fervent prayer in this great distress, and he was pleased to give them a gracious and speedy answer both to their own and to the Indians' admiration that lived amongst them. For all the morning and greatest part of the day it was clear weather and very hot, and not a cloud or any sign of rain to be seen. Yet toward evening it began to overcast, and shortly after to rain with such sweet and gentle showers as gave them cause of rejoicing and blessing God. It came without either wind or thunder or any violence, and by degrees in that abundance as the
that the earth was thoroughly wet and soaked therewith, which did so apparently revive and quicken the decayed corn and other fruits, as was wonderful to see, and made the Indians astonished to behold. An Indian named Hobomak witnessed this event and said to a pilgrim, "Now I see that the Englishman's God is a good God, for he hath heard you and sent you rain, and that without storms and tempests and thunder, which usually we have with our rain, which breaks down our corn, but yours stands whole and good and still. Surely your God is a good God." Amen. The rains rejuvenated the dying crops, and the harvest of 1623 brought plenty to each person, with the more industrious pilgrims even having excess to sell. They once again set aside a time of thanksgiving to God. Significantly, from the time the pilgrims began adopting biblical economic system, no general want ever again existed among them. Looking back over the amazing story of the Pilgrims, many improbable facts stand out. On their way to America, the storms were so fierce that the main beam broke, endangering the lives of all on board. There were no tools on the ship to make the necessary repairs, but the Pilgrims unexpectedly, and even illogically, had with them what they needed to save the ship and continue the voyage. They were not trying to go to New England, but to Northern Virginia. In fact, on their voyage they worked hard to go south, but uncommon winds beyond their control blew them to a distant northern shore they were trying to avoid, a shore that, unknown to them, was ideally suited for them and even awaiting them. They landed at a location that had been inhabited by hostile Indians who would have undoubtedly attacked and likely killed them, but who had recently been wiped out by a strange plague. They were met by Samoset, who spoke English and acquainted them with the region, and later introducing them to Squanto. And then Squanto, by his personal and even unfortunate experiences over the previous 15 years, had been uniquely equipped to help the Pilgrims. He adopted them as his own people, teaching them how to survive in the New World. Seeing all of these unlikely facts come together might suggest that the Pilgrims were a very lucky people, that the stars aligned for them as they had no other group in human history. This is one possible explanation, but the more likely one, and the one repeatedly demonstrated in the American story, is that the superintending providence of God prepared the unique pieces in this complex puzzle and then brought them together at the proper time. What occurred at Plymouth is a manifestation of the golden thread that so often runs throughout the complex tapestry of our history.